In the summer of 1968, a blonde young actress with soulful brown eyes appeared on American television and seemed to capture the mood of an entire generation. Peggy Lipton became a star as Julie Barnes on the Mod Squad, the flower child who somehow looked completely at home working undercover for the police. To millions of viewers, she was beautiful, calm, fashionable, and impossibly cool. Peggy herself rarely felt any of those things. Behind the image was a woman who had spent much of her life fighting fear, insecurity, and the feeling that she was never quite enough. Her story would take her from childhood trauma to television fame, from Paul McCartney and Elvis Presley to marriage with Quincy Jones, from motherhood and divorce to an unexpected second life in Twin Peaks. And through every version of Peggy Lipton, the same question followed her. How could someone admired by so many people have such difficulty seeing her own worth? Peggy Lipton was born Margaret Ann Lipton on August 30th, 1946, in New York City. She grew up on Long Island as the middle child of a financially comfortable Jewish family. Her mother, Rita, was an artist, while her father, Harold, worked as a successful lawyer. From the outside, Peggy's childhood offered many of the things associated with stability. The family had money, culture, and opportunities. Through her mother's Dublin-born family, Peggy also had Irish citizenship. But the child growing up inside that home was deeply anxious. Peggy was shy, unusually sensitive, and struggled with a severe stutter. Speaking could become an ordeal, especially when she encountered sounds she feared she would not be able to get past. Even saying her own name could be difficult. Years later, in her memoir, Peggy connected the worsening of her speech problems to a traumatic childhood experience. She wrote that she had been sexually abused by a relative when she was young. Whatever confidence she had possessed before that period became harder to access. Fear, shame, and self-consciousness increasingly shaped the way she dealt with other people. Peggy later remembered standing in front of a mirror and practicing expressions. She worked on smiles, looks, and ways of presenting herself almost as though she could rehearse her way into becoming a different person. That habit is revealing when you consider what happened next. The girl, terrified of being watched, eventually entered an industry built entirely around being watched. Her mother encouraged her interest in the arts, and her father helped her find modeling work. By 15, Peggy was represented by the Ford Modeling Agency. Photographs presented her as composed and exceptionally photogenic. Peggy's private experience was almost the opposite. She later said that modeling intensified her insecurity because it forced her to think constantly about how she looked. Other people could tell her she was beautiful, but that did not mean she believed them. The praise and the self-image never quite matched. In 1964, the Lipton family moved from New York to Los Angeles. Peggy was 17. California offered the possibility of starting again. She was tall, striking, and camera-friendly, and Los Angeles quickly opened doors that would have been unimaginable to the frightened child she had once been. It also introduced her to a faster social world. Peggy later described periods of depression and anxiety during which she turned to marijuana, cocaine, diet pills, and other substances in attempts to change how she felt. At the same time, acting opportunities began appearing. She signed with Universal Pictures and took small television roles, including appearances on programs such as Bewitched and The Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Every job forced her to confront the problem she had spent years trying to conceal. A line containing the wrong sound could keep her awake at night. She wrote that she sometimes wanted to ask directors whether she could rearrange a sentence but felt too embarrassed to explain why. On set, she occasionally pretended to forget a line rather than reveal that she was struggling to say it. At other times, panic became so intense that she felt close to fainting. Yet she continued. Between 1965 and 1967, the roles were small. Peggy played secretaries, schoolgirls, and other supporting characters that did not make her famous. But the importance of those jobs was not simply professional. Every completed scene proved that fear did not always have to make the decision for her. The industry saw a beautiful young woman learning how to act. Peggy was learning something more fundamental: how to remain visible when every instinct told her to disappear. That ability would soon place her at the center of one of the most recognizable television shows of the late 1960s. In 1967, producer Aaron Spelling was preparing an unusual television crime drama. The concept behind the Mod Squad was simple enough to explain, but unusual for network television at the time. Instead of conventional detectives, the series would follow three young outsiders recruited to work undercover for the police. They were supposed to understand a generation that older authority figures often could not. Peggy auditioned for the role of Julie Barnes. She was still intensely nervous about performing, and she later admitted that she smoked marijuana before the audition in an attempt to calm herself. Whether it helped or not, the producers saw exactly what they needed. Julie was supposed to look like someone who belonged naturally inside the youth culture the show wanted to portray. Peggy did. She had the straight hair, understated clothes, delicate appearance, and quiet manner associated with the period. More importantly, she possessed a combination of reserve and emotional vulnerability that could not easily be manufactured. Julie Barnes had sadness in her background. Peggy carried sadness in the way she looked at people. Series creator Bud Ruskin recognized the match, and Peggy was cast. When the Mod Squad premiered in September 1968, Peggy had just turned 22. The effect was immediate. Julie Barnes did not resemble the conventional female television characters many viewers were accustomed to seeing. She was young, independent, compassionate, fashionable, and part of a team that seemed to belong to the world happening outside the studio gates. Peggy starred alongside Michael Cole as Pete Cochran and Clarence Williams III as Link Hayes. The chemistry among the three became central to the show's appeal. The series also placed a highly visible interracial group of young leads at the center of primetime television during a period of intense social conflict in the United States. The Mod Squad dealt with racism, drugs, generational conflict, distrust of authority, and changing attitudes among young Americans, although it translated those issues into the language of network entertainment. For younger viewers, the cultural politics were only part of the attraction. The three leads simply looked cool, and Julie Barnes became an image young people could imitate. Her straight hair, fringe, boots, miniskirts, love beads, and bell-bottoms became part of Peggy Lipton's public identity. Girls copied her clothes and hairstyles. Boys developed enormous crushes on her. Some viewers would remember decades later exactly where they sat when they watched the program, who they watched it with, or how badly they wanted to look like Julie. That kind of memory explains something statistics cannot. Peggy Lipton did not merely appear in a successful television series. For a particular generation, she became attached to childhood itself. Before we move from Peggy's public breakthrough into the life unfolding behind it, a quick note about my other series, Hollywood Histories. It's a weekly podcast devoted to stories from movie history, including forgotten personalities, strange locations, old theaters, and corners of Hollywood with histories that are sometimes glamorous, sometimes tragic, and occasionally ridiculous. One episode looks at the Earl Carroll Theater, one of old Hollywood's most spectacular venues and a place with a surprisingly dark story. Other episodes explore locations including the Shelton Apartments, along with the much lighter history of the Hollywood Wax Museum. If those kinds of stories appeal to you, the series is available to YouTube members and Patreon supporters at the Hollywood's tier or above. It costs $3 a month and includes those extra episodes along with other bonus material. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel. It genuinely helps keep these longer stories going. Now back to Peggy, because becoming Julie Barnes solved one problem in her life while creating several new ones. For several years after the Mod Squad premiered, Peggy Lipton seemed to be everywhere. Magazine covers, fashion layouts, television interviews, publicity photographs, and fan magazines turned her into one of the most recognizable young women in American popular culture. Her influence extended beyond acting. She released music, recording songs associated with writers including Donovan and Laura Nyro. Her version of Stony End appeared before Barbra Streisand recorded the song and turned it into a much bigger hit. Peggy enjoyed singing, but she never seemed to regard it as the center of her career. Acting remained the work that mattered most. Success also brought formal recognition. In 1971, Peggy won a Golden Globe for her work on The Mod Squad and received Emmy attention during the series' run. To audiences, everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. Peggy was young, famous, financially successful, and celebrated for the very appearance she had doubted since adolescence. But fame did not repair the distance between public image and private self. It often widened it. Peggy later spoke about how little confidence she had when the Mod Squad began. On a set, she understood what was expected of her. There were scripts, marks, cameras, rehearsals, and specific work to complete. Social situations were harder. At Hollywood parties or publicity events, Peggy could become unsure of how to speak to strangers, where to look, or how to behave when photographers surrounded her. Michael Cole later remembered the contrast. The woman millions of viewers considered effortlessly cool could stand quietly at the edge of a room, almost retreating from the attention directed at her. That tension may also explain why Julie Barnes felt believable. Peggy did not play Julie as a loud revolutionary or a glamorous fantasy with no inner life. There was softness in the performance. Sometimes, even when Peggy smiled, there seemed to be another emotion behind her eyes. Viewers noticed it. Decades later, many would remember not just her appearance, but that melancholy quality. Julie seemed kind because Peggy herself could appear vulnerable without appearing weak. The same sensitivity that had caused Peggy so much discomfort became part of what audiences responded to. That is one of the strangest aspects of celebrity. The quality a performer spends years wishing she could remove may become the quality the audience values most. Peggy had wanted to overcome her shyness, her uncertainty, and the feeling that she did not quite belong. Instead, television turned them into part of her screen presence. The world saw serenity. Peggy often experienced effort, and once fame placed her inside the social world of late 60s Hollywood and rock music, the search for confidence moved into another part of her life: love. Peggy's private life began attracting attention even before the Mod Squad made her famous. The most memorable example came in August 1964. Peggy was 17 when the Beatles arrived in Los Angeles during the period when Beatlemania had become almost impossible to escape. Like millions of teenagers, Peggy was fascinated by the group. Paul McCartney was her particular idol. At a gathering connected with the Beatles' visit, Peggy managed to meet him. According to the account she later gave in her memoir, McCartney noticed her and complimented her appearance. For a teenager who already doubted how she looked, hearing that from one of the most famous young men in the world carried enormous emotional weight. Later that evening, Peggy received an invitation to join the group at the house where they were staying. She went. Peggy's memoir describes the night as the fulfillment of a fantasy she had already built in her imagination. She and McCartney became intimate. The important part of the story, however, was what happened emotionally once the fantasy met reality. The Beatles left Los Angeles. McCartney returned to the life of a touring superstar. Peggy remained behind. Nothing unusually cruel had to happen for the experience to hurt. The imbalance was built into the situation from the beginning. Peggy had spent months imagining what it would mean to be chosen by someone she idolized. Once it happened, she discovered that being chosen for one night and being securely loved were very different things. That distinction became important in the years that followed. As Peggy's own celebrity grew, so did her access to famous men. She dated producer Lou Adler, spent time around musicians connected with the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield, and had a relationship with Donovan. Her name would eventually be linked to actors and rock stars including Terrence Stamp, Keith Moon, and Elvis Presley. From the outside, this looked like extraordinary romantic freedom. Peggy's later description was more complicated. She said many of those relationships were driven by fantasy. The person in front of her could become a symbol of what she hoped the relationship might provide: validation, excitement, protection, escape, or proof that she was desirable. When the excitement faded, the underlying insecurity remained. That does not mean Peggy lacked agency. She pursued people she wanted, she made choices, she participated fully in the sexual culture around her, but the emotional meaning of those choices mattered. Peggy later said she was often trying to heal wounds while refusing to show other people how sad she felt. The romances were not the cause of every problem in her life. They were one of the places where existing problems became visible. This also explains why reducing Peggy to a list of famous lovers misses most of the story. The remarkable part was not that an extremely attractive television star could date famous men. The remarkable part was that admiration from those men repeatedly failed to alter the way Peggy saw herself. McCartney was the clearest early example. She reached the person she had dreamed about. The fantasy came true, and the emotional question that existed before him was still there when he left. Peggy's later memories of famous men often revealed less about glamour than about the people trapped inside glamorous images. Elvis Presley was one example. By the late 1960s, Elvis was already an icon Peggy had known from a distance for years. When she eventually spent private time with him, she expected to encounter the confident figure the public associated with the king of rock and roll. According to Peggy's memoir, the evening turned out very differently. She described Elvis as unexpectedly vulnerable and sexually insecure. Rather than turning the episode into a joke at his expense, Peggy remembered the insecurity behind the image. The two spent much of the night talking. That detail matters more than the bedroom gossip. Peggy, a woman whom millions believed to be effortlessly desirable, found herself sitting with a man millions considered effortlessly powerful. Both public images concealed something far less secure. For Peggy, the encounter offered another reminder that fame could hide weakness rather than eliminate it. Not every experience from those years was gentle. Peggy also wrote about an encounter with Sammy Davis Jr. that became frightening. She described Davis as persistent beyond a point she was comfortable with, and said she eventually left the situation in panic. The episode stood out partly because Peggy later acknowledged how difficult she sometimes found it to say no when she was younger. Her desire for approval could make boundaries harder to defend. There were other relationships and experiments. During her time with actor Terence Stamp, Peggy tried peyote in 1968. She explored meditation, mysticism, psychedelic drugs, and different versions of the counterculture that surrounded Los Angeles. The press could easily package all of this as the adventures of a beautiful free spirit. That description contains some truth. Peggy did participate enthusiastically in the era around her, but free spirit can make a complicated young person sound simpler than she was. She was still carrying childhood trauma. She was still struggling with depression. She was still using substances. And she was still trying to understand whether attention from another person could create the sense of security she had difficulty creating for herself. By the beginning of the 1970s, the answer was becoming clearer. Excitement was easy to find. Stability was not. The cultural moment around Peggy was changing too. The optimism and experimentation associated with the late 60s were giving way to something less innocent. The Mod Squad itself could not remain young forever. Neither could Peggy. For the first time, she began seriously imagining a life built around permanence rather than novelty. That change led her toward Quincy Jones. By 1972, Peggy Lipton had spent much of her adult life in motion. She had moved from modeling to television, from anonymous supporting roles to national fame, and from one intense relationship to another. Then she met Quincy Jones. Jones was already a respected musician, composer, arranger, and producer. He was older than Peggy, divorced, and the father of children from an earlier marriage. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances of their introduction, but the attraction developed quickly. Peggy saw something in Quincy that felt different from the relationships that had dominated her youth. He seemed grounded. He had already built an adult life beyond celebrity romance. And for Peggy, who had spent years looking for security in people who were often as unsettled as she was, that difference mattered. Their relationship became serious. By late 1973, Peggy was pregnant. At roughly the same moment, the Mod Squad was ending. Peggy suddenly faced a decision that few stars at the height of their visibility willingly make. She could keep pursuing Hollywood momentum, or she could build a family. She chose the family. In 1974, Peggy married Quincy Jones and largely withdrew from acting. Their daughter Kidada was born that year, followed by Rashida in 1976. For the first time since adolescence, Peggy's life stopped revolving around whether a camera wanted her. She became deeply involved in raising her daughters. The ordinary details mattered to her: diapers, carpools, school, home life. The kinds of routines that might have seemed dull to someone chasing fame could feel almost radical to a woman who had rarely experienced emotional quiet. Peggy later spoke of the sense of normality marriage and motherhood gave her. It was also a life she actively chose. That distinction is important. Peggy did not simply disappear because Hollywood stopped calling. She stepped away. For years, young viewers who had grown up watching Julie Barnes wondered where she had gone. There was no social media feed explaining the answer, no constant stream of celebrity updates. To a child watching television in the early 70s, Peggy seemed to vanish. In reality, she had redirected her life towards something she believed she needed more. Family life was not free of difficulty. Peggy's marriage to Quincy was interracial, and the couple encountered racist hostility. Peggy later described her own mother's initial discomfort with the relationship and with the idea of interracial grandchildren. The couple also received hateful anonymous messages and comments from strangers. Over time, Peggy said her mother accepted the marriage and became close to her granddaughters. But the hostility around the relationship exposed how far the social changes celebrated on shows such as the Mod Squad still had to go outside television. Peggy remained connected to the entertainment world through Quincy. As his career expanded, particularly during the 1980s, their home became part of a much larger musical universe. Artists moved through Quincy's professional life, and Peggy attended sessions, events, and gatherings while also maintaining the household and raising their children. She even received a songwriting credit connected with Frank Sinatra's "L.A. is My Lady." From a distance, Peggy appeared to have successfully exchanged one glamorous life for another. But the emotional problem at the center of her story had never completely disappeared. The question had changed. When she was young, Peggy wondered whether Hollywood wanted her. Now she sometimes wondered whether the man she loved still needed her. Quincy Jones's career expanded enormously during the years Peggy spent away from acting. That success brought opportunity, travel, long working hours, and an increasingly demanding professional life. Peggy was often at home with their daughters. Gradually, some of the insecurity she thought she had left behind began returning. Marriage had given Peggy stability, but it had also become the structure around which she organized much of her identity. She was Quincy's wife. She was Kidada and Rashida's mother. She was the woman who had left acting. Those were real and meaningful parts of her life. But after years away from her own career, Peggy increasingly had to confront a more difficult question. Who was she when those roles were not enough? By 1986, the marriage was breaking down. Peggy and Quincy separated. The divorce was eventually finalized in 1989. Both continued to speak of each other with affection, and their relationship remained far more civil than many celebrity divorces. That did not make the separation painless. Peggy had once viewed Quincy as the great stabilizing love of her adult life. Losing the marriage meant losing the future she had imagined when she walked away from Hollywood 15 years earlier. At around the same time, acting returned to her life. In 1988, Peggy accepted a role in the television movie Addicted to His Love. She had not spent the previous decade preparing for a comeback. She entered cautiously. What surprised her was how familiar the work still felt. The camera no longer carried exactly the same meaning it had when she was 20. Peggy did not need acting to prove that she was beautiful. She did not need it to make her famous. She already knew what fame could and could not provide. For the first time, acting could belong to her simply because she enjoyed the craft. Peggy later reflected on how long it had taken her to understand her own value. That realization did not arrive as a sudden transformation. She did not become a completely different person at 40. The insecurity remained part of her, but it no longer controlled every decision with the same force. Age gave Peggy something that youth, beauty, and celebrity had failed to provide. Perspective. She had been the girl everyone wanted to look like. She had been the woman famous men wanted to meet. She had been a wife and a mother. Now she was beginning to discover what remained when those identities stopped answering every question. That shift might have stayed private if not for a director whose work depended on finding something unusual inside familiar faces. David Lynch was casting a new television series, and he saw Peggy Lipton very differently from the producers who had cast Julie Barnes 20 years earlier. In 1989, David Lynch cast Peggy Lipton as Norma Jennings in Twin Peaks. It was an inspired choice. Norma owned the Double R Diner, a warm, familiar presence inside a town filled with secrets, violence, eccentricity, and surreal events. Peggy did not need to dominate scenes to make Norma memorable. The role depended on restraint. A look across the diner, a small change in expression, a smile that contained more than one emotion. Those were qualities Peggy had been using on screen since the Mod Squad. But age changed how audiences read them. Julie Barnes had seemed like a young woman carrying sadness she did not yet know what to do with. Norma Jennings felt like a woman who had lived with disappointment long enough to understand it. That difference gave Peggy's career an unusual continuity. Twin Peaks premiered in 1990 and became one of the defining television series of its era. For viewers who had grown up with the Mod Squad, seeing Peggy again could feel like discovering someone they had lost. For younger viewers, Norma was their introduction to her. Some of those people would only learn years later that the woman behind the counter at the Double R Diner had once been one of television's great youth culture icons. Peggy loved the role. She later described playing Norma as one of the happiest experiences of her acting life. And the timing mattered. The first time Peggy became famous, she was barely comfortable being herself. The second time audiences embraced her, she was entering her 40s and had already lived through fame, motherhood, separation, and divorce. She no longer had to pretend that adulthood was something she understood. She had earned it. Peggy continued appearing in film and television through the following decades. She returned to the Twin Peaks universe in Fire Walk with Me and accepted a variety of smaller roles. The scale of the jobs mattered less than it once had. She could work without carrying the burden of being the symbol of an entire generation. Then, in 2017, David Lynch returned to Twin Peaks. Peggy returned with him. Once again, Norma Jennings stood inside the Double R Diner. Nearly 50 years had passed since Julie Barnes first appeared on television. The visual difference was obvious. The emotional connection was not. Peggy still had the quiet presence viewers remembered. She still seemed capable of expressing sadness without announcing it. But there was something else now. Calm. That return became one of Peggy's final screen appearances and provided an almost perfect bookend to her career. Julie and Norma belonged to different generations of television. Peggy connected them. A viewer could have loved her as a child in 1968, rediscovered her as an adult in 1990, and seen her again as an older person in 2017. Very few actors get to age alongside an audience in quite that way, and that may explain why so many viewers remember Peggy Lipton with unusual affection. She was not simply someone they watched. For many people, she was there at different stages of their own lives. One of the strangest chapters in Peggy Lipton's later life had almost nothing to do with Hollywood. In the 2000s, Peggy was living quietly in New York and dealing with a serious health crisis. She had been diagnosed with colon cancer in 2004. During that period, she became close to Jack Chartier, a political operative connected to the office of New York State Comptroller Alan Hevesi. Chartier was deeply devoted to Peggy. He helped her during treatment, spent time at her apartment, assisted with practical matters, and became part of her support system while she was ill. The relationship eventually became connected to a much larger corruption investigation involving New York State pension investments. The crucial point is that Peggy was not accused of running the scheme or participating in the pension corruption. The problem concerned what Chartier and other people did around her. Investigators found that individuals seeking influence with state officials had provided financial benefits connected to Peggy and her family. One businessman paid roughly $90,000 toward expenses including rent and medical costs. Other money was connected with a business venture involving one of Peggy's daughters. Those payments became significant because the people providing them had business interests tied to state pension decisions. What may have looked to Peggy like help from a devoted friend became evidence inside a political corruption case. When the investigation became public, her name suddenly appeared in headlines beside pension funds, bribery allegations, and government officials. For someone who had spent decades largely outside scandal, the experience was humiliating. The story also created an easy misunderstanding. Receiving help with rent or medical bills did not establish that Peggy had died poor or that she had been abandoned by her former husband and family. Nor did investigators accuse her of secretly directing the payments. The legal wrongdoing centered on people who used political influence and financial favors improperly. Peggy was drawn into the story because of Chartier's attachment to her. Eventually, the investigation moved on from Peggy as authorities focused on the people responsible for the actual pension misconduct. For her, it remained a strange and unwanted late-life episode. Once again, someone else's fascination with Peggy Lipton's image had created consequences she never asked for. But unlike the gossip of her youth, this time she wanted nothing to do with being the woman at the center of the story. By the 2010s, Peggy was living in Los Angeles again and spending more time close to her daughters. Kidada and Rashida had grown into accomplished women with creative careers of their own. For Peggy, motherhood remained one of the central achievements of her life. Her health, however, continued to demand attention. The colon cancer diagnosed in 2004 went into remission after treatment. Peggy later encouraged other people to undergo screening and spoke publicly about the importance of early detection. Eventually, the cancer returned. She kept much of the final stage of her illness private. On May 11, 2019, Peggy Lipton died in Los Angeles at the age of 72. Her daughters announced that she had died peacefully with members of her family beside her. The tributes that followed revealed just how many different Peggy Liptons existed in public memory. There was Julie Barnes. For viewers who had been children or teenagers in the late 60s and early 70s, Julie represented a particular idea of cool. The straight hair, the clothes, the gentle voice, the attitude of someone who could belong to the counterculture without appearing cynical. Some women had copied her wardrobe. Some men remembered her as one of their first crushes. Some people remembered watching the Mod Squad beside a parent who was no longer alive. Those memories had very little to do with Hollywood gossip. Peggy had become attached to people's own histories. Then there was Norma Jennings. A different generation knew Peggy through the Double R Diner. Norma was older than Julie, more grounded and less interested in appearing rebellious, but viewers recognized the same emotional quality: warmth mixed with melancholy, strength that did not need to become hardness. Peggy's career therefore created an unusual bridge between two television eras. And there was another audience as well: people who never watched the Mod Squad, people who never watched Twin Peaks, people who discovered Peggy only after hearing the story of a woman who spent years being told she was beautiful while struggling to believe she had value. That may be the part of her life that travels furthest beyond celebrity. Peggy had many of the things people assume should create confidence: beauty, fame, money, successful work, famous partners, a glamorous social world. None of them automatically produced self-worth. She spent much of her youth looking outward for something that could settle the argument she was having with herself. Romance did not do it. Celebrity did not do it. Being admired did not do it. Over time, motherhood, age, work, loss, and experience gave her a different relationship with herself. Not a perfect one, a more realistic one. Peggy Lipton's life was not simply a tragic rise and fall. She did not spend 5 decades descending from the height of the Mod Squad. She changed. She left Hollywood when she wanted a family. She raised 2 daughters. She survived a divorce. She returned to acting on different terms. She found another defining role more than 20 years after the first one, and she remained close to people who had mattered to her even when those relationships changed form. That is a far more interesting story than the number of famous men she once knew. Peggy herself understood that celebrity could create an illusion. The public sees photographs, roles, clothes, marriages, parties, and magazine covers and imagines those fragments add up to a complete life. They never do. The woman behind Julie Barnes was more frightened than Julie looked. The woman behind the glamorous Jones marriage sometimes felt alone. And the older actress behind Norma Jennings had learned things the 22-year-old Peggy could not possibly have known. Maybe that is why the sadness people noticed in her eyes never made her seem cold. It made her recognizable. For viewers who loved the Mod Squad, Peggy Lipton remains the impossibly cool girl of 1968. For Twin Peaks fans, she will always be Norma behind the counter at the Double R. And for people discovering her for the first time, she leaves a different story. A reminder that a person can be admired by millions and still spend years learning how to value herself. I hope you enjoyed this look at Peggy Lipton's life. If you remember her from the Mod Squad, Twin Peaks, or somewhere completely different, let me know in the comments. And if Peggy was someone you only discovered through this episode, I'd be interested to hear that too. I've been Ava, thanks for watching, and until next time, sweet dreams.